At the heart of this tranquil place were Nathan Parker and Emily Foster, a couple who had lived their entire lives in Silver Creek. Nathan, with his dark hair and square jaw, was the town's golden boy. He had grown up in the town, working from a young age at his father's auto shop and eventually taking over the family business. He was reliable, responsible, and had a certain magnetism that made people gravitate toward him. Emily, his childhood sweetheart, was the perfect complement to Nathan. She was a soft-spoken schoolteacher with a passion for art and children, known for her delicate beauty and kindness. The two had been inseparable since high school, their love story unfolding like a page out of a fairy tale. Everyone in Silver Creek knew them as the perfect couple, and when Nathan proposed to Emily one warm evening in July, it seemed like the entire town celebrated their engagement. But just as in all fairy tales, darkness lurked in the shadows. Nathan's life before Emily wasn't without complications. He had a past that came in the form of Sarah Kane, a volatile and unpredictable woman he had dated for 3 years. Sarah was a striking beauty, with fiery red hair and a quick wit that captivated Nathan when they first met. But their relationship had been toxic from the start, plagued by constant fights, jealous outbursts, and emotional manipulation. Sarah was possessive in a way that bordered on obsession. She had a way of making Nathan feel guilty for every moment he spent away from her, accusing him of cheating, of not caring enough. It wasn't long before her outbursts became more intense, violent even. She had once thrown a glass at him during a fight, shattering it against the wall when he tried to leave. But Nathan had always been too kind, too forgiving. He believed he could fix her, that she just needed time to heal from her own troubled past. But Nathan couldn't fix Sarah. Their relationship spiraled out of control until one day, he finally broke things off for good. It had taken him months to gather the strength to do it. But when he met Emily, he knew he couldn't be held back by the wreckage of his past any longer. Sarah, however, wasn't the kind of woman who accepted rejection easily. The night before Nathan and Emily's wedding, Sarah was seen at Rusty's Tavern, a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of Silver Creek. She sat alone in the back corner, sipping whiskey as her eyes burned holes into her phone screen. She was scrolling through social media, looking at the flood of congratulatory posts celebrating Nathan and Emily's upcoming nuptials. Photos of Emily in her bridal gown, beaming with happiness, filled her feed. Every image was a knife to the heart, twisting deeper with each passing second. Sarah's thoughts were consumed by Nathan. In her mind, they weren't supposed to be over. He had belonged to her, always belonged to her, and yet here he was, preparing to marry another woman. Her fingers tightened around the glass in her hand, her knuckles turning white. She had seen it coming, but she had always believed Nathan would come back to her in the end. How could he not? They had a connection, a bond that went beyond the ordinary. She was certain he felt it too, even if he pretended otherwise. As the night wore on and the alcohol numbed her pain, Sarah's anger boiled over. She stood up abruptly, knocking over her drink, and stormed out of the bar, muttering to herself as she pushed past the other patrons. The bartender, a burly man with a grizzled beard, shook his head as he watched her leave. He had seen her like this before, on the edge of something dangerous. Sarah got into her car, her mind racing with thoughts of revenge. She drove aimlessly for hours, the roads blurring together as her fury intensified. The world outside her windshield seemed to warp, the streetlights flickering like ghosts in the fog. By the time she pulled up to the small one-bedroom house she rented, she was trembling with rage. She fumbled for her keys, but when she finally got inside, she didn't head to bed. Instead, she grabbed a notebook from her desk and began to write feverishly, her handwriting becoming more erratic with each passing minute. If I can't have him, no one can. Her mind buzzed with possibilities. She had been in Nathan's life before Emily, before anyone else. She knew him in ways Emily never could. And if she couldn't be a part of his future, then he wouldn't have a future at all. The day of Nathan and Emily's wedding had been everything they dreamed of. The ceremony took place in the lush gardens of Emily's parents' estate, a sprawling piece of land that had been in her family for generations. Friends and family gathered under the warm summer sun, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming roses and lavender. Emily walked down the aisle, her arm linked with her father's, as Nathan stood at the altar, his heart pounding with anticipation. The vows they exchanged were simple yet heartfelt, promises to love and cherish one another for the rest of their lives. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause, and the couple shared their first kiss as newlyweds. It was a picture-perfect moment, one that would be etched into the memories of everyone who witnessed it. That evening, they hosted a small reception at a charming bed and breakfast nestled by the lake on the outskirts of town. The guests danced beneath the stars, and laughter echoed through the night as Nathan and Emily celebrated their new life together. They had booked the honeymoon suite for the night, a quaint, rustic room with exposed beams and a cozy fireplace. The future seemed bright, filled with the promise of happiness. But the next morning, Silver Creek woke to a horrific discovery. The couple's bodies were found in the very suite where they had spent their first night as husband and wife. Emily's throat had been slit, her white satin nightgown soaked in blood. Nathan had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, his body sprawled across the bed in a gruesome display of violence. The room had been ransacked, lamps overturned, mirrors shattered, and the once beautiful wedding flowers now trampled beneath bloodstains. The town of Silver Creek was rocked to its core. Murders were unheard of in this quiet, peaceful place, and the idea that someone could commit such a heinous act within their midst sent waves of fear and panic through the community. Sheriff Mark Ridley, a veteran lawman with graying hair and a face weathered by years of experience, was immediately called to the scene. Sheriff Ridley had served in Silver Creek for over 3 decades and knew almost everyone in town personally. He had watched Nathan grow from a young boy into a responsible man, and seeing his lifeless body now was something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The scene was nothing short of a massacre. Ridley carefully stepped around the bloodstains, his heart heavy as he surveyed the damage. His deputies, younger and less experienced, looked pale as they tried to process the horror before them. "I want a full sweep of the area," Ridley ordered, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his gut. "We need to find out who did this. And fast." There were no immediate signs of forced entry, and that only made the case more troubling. Whoever had committed the crime had likely been someone the couple knew or at least trusted enough to let inside. Ridley's mind immediately turned to Sarah. He had known about her volatile relationship with Nathan and her inability to let go. Everyone in town knew about it. Her outbursts, her fits of jealousy. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Ridley and his team quickly headed to Sarah's house to question her. But when they arrived, the place was eerily quiet. The shades were drawn and the front door was locked. After several minutes of knocking, they decided to break down the door. Inside, they found nothing but silence, no sign of Sarah. However, on her kitchen counter, they discovered a piece of paper with a chilling message scrawled in red ink. "If I can't have him, no one can." It didn't take long for the sheriff to issue a warrant for Sarah's arrest. The news spread through town like wildfire. People whispered about Sarah's erratic behavior, her obsession with Nathan, and how everyone had seen it coming. But no one had expected it to end like this. With Nathan and Emily dead, their lives cut short before they could even begin their new chapter together. As the search for Sarah intensified, roadblocks were set up on all major roads leading out of town. Deputies patrolled the highways, and volunteers from the community scoured the nearby woods and fields. The local news stations ran non-stop coverage, turning Silver Creek into a media circus. Reporters descended on the town, hungry for details about the grisly murders and the manhunt for the missing ex-girlfriend. Days passed and still, Sarah remained at large. The town was gripped by fear, unsure whether she was hiding among them or had fled into the surrounding wilderness. The pressure on Sheriff Ridley was immense. He barely slept, spending every waking hour poring over evidence, trying to piece together Sarah's whereabouts. He knew she was dangerous, unpredictable, and he feared what she might do if cornered. Then, on the third day, there was a breakthrough. A patrol officer spotted someone lurking near the couple's home late at night. The figure was partially obscured by the shadows, but the officer recognized the unmistakable flash of red hair. It was Sarah. She was quickly apprehended and brought into custody, her once beautiful appearance now disheveled and wild. Her clothes were stained with dirt, her hands trembling as she was led into the sheriff's office. But despite her capture, there was something unsettling about the way she carried herself. She didn't seem remorseful or frightened. Instead, she seemed almost detached, as though the murders hadn't shaken her at all. Sheriff Ridley was used to dealing with criminals, but something about Sarah sent a chill down his spine. He had never encountered someone so eerily calm after committing such an atrocious crime. As she sat in the interrogation room, staring blankly at the wall, Ridley began to wonder if there was more to this story than just a crime of passion. Sheriff Ridley watched Sarah from behind the two-way mirror, his eyes narrowing as he studied her body language. There was a strange stillness to her, a kind of eerie calm that didn't match the violent nature of the crime she had allegedly committed. Something didn't add up. Ridley had seen his fair share of killers during his long career, some of them cold-blooded, others remorseful, but Sarah was different. She seemed almost detached. "She's not saying a word," one of his deputies, John Harris, said as he stood beside the sheriff. "We've had her in there for hours, but she hasn't so much as blinked. Just sits there staring at the wall." Ridley nodded, his brow furrowing in thought. "What about the evidence from the crime scene? Anything conclusive?" Harris hesitated. "We've got Sarah's fingerprints on the doorknob, and we found traces of her hair on the bedspread. But there's something else, something strange." Ridley turned to him, his interest piqued. "What is it?" "We found another set of fingerprints," Harris explained, his voice lowering as if he were afraid to speak too loudly. "They don't match Sarah, Nathan, or Emily. We ran them through the system, but we came up empty." Ridley's heart skipped a beat. Another set of fingerprints? He hadn't expected that. The assumption had been that Sarah had acted alone in a fit of jealous rage, but now there was evidence suggesting that someone else had been involved, someone who had been in the room during the murders. Ridley's mind raced. Who could it be? A friend of Sarah's? Someone she had roped into her twisted plan? Or was there something even darker at play? "Keep running those prints," Ridley ordered. "Check for any known associates, family members, anyone who might have had a connection to Sarah." As the investigation continued, Ridley couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. Sarah's behavior was too calm, too calculated. It was almost as if she wanted to be caught. But why? What was she hiding? Then one night, as Ridley sat alone in his office, going over old case files, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Years ago, before Sarah had moved to Silver Creek, there had been a man in her life. His name was Robert Kane, and he had disappeared under mysterious circumstances shortly after ending a tumultuous relationship with Sarah. The case had never been solved, and Robert's body had never been found. At the time, there had been rumors that Sarah was involved, but without any concrete evidence, the case went cold. Ridley's fingers trembled as he read through the details of Robert's disappearance. Could it be possible that Robert was still alive? And if so, had he been involved in Nathan and Emily's murders? The more Ridley thought about it, the more it made sense. Sarah had a history of toxic relationships, of obsession and control. What if Robert had never truly left her life? What if he had been hiding all this time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Ridley immediately ordered his team to dig deeper into Robert Kane's past. to track down any leads that might point to his whereabouts. The idea that Robert could still be alive and working with Sarah sent shockwaves through the investigation. Then came the breakthrough. Forensic analysis revealed that the second set of fingerprints found at the crime scene belonged to none other than Robert Kane. The man who had supposedly disappeared years ago had resurfaced, and he had been at the scene of the murders. Ridley's heart pounded as he processed the information. Robert was alive, and not only that, he had been Sarah's accomplice. The gruesome nature of the crime suddenly made sense. It wasn't just a jealous ex-girlfriend lashing out in a fit of rage. It was the culmination of years of obsession, manipulation, and a toxic partnership that had spiraled out of control. But now, Robert was gone again, vanished without a trace. Sheriff Ridley stood at the crime scene once more, looking at the blood-stained room that had once been filled with love and hope. The air was heavy with the scent of death and loss, and Ridley knew that justice had not truly been served. Sarah was behind bars, but the real mastermind, Robert Kane, was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next move. The town of Silver Creek was left reeling, haunted by the knowledge that a killer was still at large. People whispered about Robert's return, speculating about where he might be hiding and whether he would come back to finish what he started. For Sheriff Ridley, the case would never truly be closed. Every time he drove past Nathan and Emily's abandoned home, he couldn't help but wonder, would Robert strike again? The days passed, and Silver Creek settled into a tense, uneasy calm. The once lively streets of the small town were now quieter, with fewer people venturing out after dark. The wedding that had united Nathan and Emily had become the catalyst for an unshakable fear. A reminder that even in the most peaceful places, evil could lurk. Despite the quiet, the investigation was far from over. Sheriff Ridley couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Robert Kane was still in Silver Creek. His disappearance years ago had never felt right, and now that he knew Robert was not only alive but a willing participant in the murders, the sheriff became obsessed with finding him. Ridley's sleepless nights intensified, his mind working overtime as he retraced the steps of the investigation, searching for any clue that could lead him to Robert's whereabouts. Sarah Kane, meanwhile, sat in her jail cell, refusing to talk. She didn't protest her innocence, nor did she confess to the crime. She remained silent, her eyes vacant as if her mind was elsewhere. The locals speculated about her state of mind. Some believed she had snapped under the weight of her obsession with Nathan, while others thought she had been brainwashed by Robert. But whatever the truth, Sarah seemed utterly disconnected from the reality of what she had done. Her silence only fueled the town's gossip, and soon rumors began to spread like wildfire. Whispers of Robert Kane being spotted in nearby towns reached Sheriff Ridley, but each lead turned out to be a dead end. Robert had vanished like a ghost, and despite Ridley's best efforts, the trail had gone cold. Weeks turned into months, and the town slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy, though the scars from the murders ran deep. The honeymoon suite at the bed and breakfast where Nathan and Emily had been killed remained closed, a grim reminder of the violence that had shattered the town's peace. The owner of the inn, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Perkins, refused to open the room to guests, believing it was cursed. She had known Nathan since he was a boy and couldn't bear the thought of anyone else occupying the space where such a terrible tragedy had occurred. Sheriff Ridley, however, was not so quick to let go. His obsession with the case grew, and as he pored over the evidence again and again, one detail continued to gnaw at him: the timeline. Something about the timing of the murders didn't sit right with him. Sarah had been captured quickly, and the forensic evidence had placed her at the scene of the crime. But if Robert had been there too, how had he managed to slip away unnoticed? The bed and breakfast wasn't isolated. There were neighbors nearby, and it was hard to believe that no one had seen him flee. Ridley decided to revisit the crime scene himself, hoping to find something, anything, that could give him a new lead. One evening, He drove to the bed and breakfast, the setting sun casting long shadows over the town. The once beautiful gardens around the inn had become overgrown and neglected, a reflection of the town's lingering grief. Mrs. Perkins greeted Ridley at the door, her face lined with sorrow. She hadn't been the same since the murders, her once bright and warm demeanor now replaced with a quiet sadness. She offered him a cup of tea, which he politely declined, and led him up the creaky wooden staircase to the infamous honeymoon suite. As Ridley stepped inside, the air felt thick with tension. The room had been cleaned, but the memory of what had happened there was palpable. He stood in the center of the room, letting his eyes wander over the furnishings, the bed, the windows. He imagined the scene, Nathan and Emily, blissfully unaware of the danger that awaited them, lying in bed as Sarah and Robert crept in. But something didn't add up. Ridley knelt by the bed, examining the floorboards beneath it. He had been through this room a dozen times before, but this time, something caught his eye. One of the floorboards was slightly loose. His pulse quickened as he carefully pried it up, revealing a small, hidden compartment beneath the floor. Inside was a small, worn notebook. Ridley's hands trembled as he opened it. The pages were filled with chaotic, scrawled handwriting, Sarah's handwriting. But as he flipped through the pages, he realized that not all of it was hers. Some of the entries were written in a different hand, neat, deliberate, and chillingly familiar. Robert's handwriting. The notebook chronicled the entire plan, written in painstaking detail. The first few entries were Sarah's, filled with obsessive ramblings about Nathan, her desperation to win him back, and her growing frustration with Emily. But as the entries went on, Robert's handwriting appeared more frequently, guiding and manipulating Sarah's thoughts. It was clear that Robert had been the mastermind all along, feeding into Sarah's insecurities and pushing her to commit the unthinkable. He had used her as a pawn, preying on her vulnerability and obsession with Nathan. The notebook revealed that the plan had been in motion for months, long before Nathan and Emily's wedding. But one entry in particular stood out to Ridley. It was dated the night before the wedding and written in Robert's hand. "It's time. She'll do anything for me, and soon they'll both be gone. By morning, no one will ever know the truth." Ridley's heart raced as he continued reading. The final entry was a chilling confession of sorts, written by Robert in the hours after the murders. He described how he had manipulated Sarah into killing Nathan and Emily, but he also revealed something even more disturbing. He had never intended to stay with Sarah. "Once it's done, she'll be left holding the knife. I'll disappear, just like I always do. She was just another tool, another game. I'll be long gone before anyone even realizes I was here." The truth hit Ridley like a punch to the gut. Robert had not only orchestrated the murders, but had also planned to frame Sarah for the entire thing. She had been a pawn in his twisted game from the start, and now she was rotting in jail while Robert was free, hiding in the shadows, watching as his plan unfolded perfectly. Ridley's mind raced. He needed to act fast. With this new evidence, he could finally expose Robert for what he was, a manipulative killer who had used Sarah to carry out his dark fantasies. But as Ridley stood up, clutching the notebook, a noise from outside the room made him freeze. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the hallway. Ridley's pulse quickened, and he instinctively reached for his gun. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a moment, there was silence, thick and suffocating. Ridley's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to hear any movement. Then, the door creaked open and a figure stepped into the room. It was Robert Kane. Ridley's breath caught in his throat. Robert stood there, his face partially obscured by the shadows, but his eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating intensity. He smiled, a slow, sinister grin that sent a chill down Ridley's spine. "Looking for something, Sheriff?" Robert asked, his voice smooth and taunting. Ridley didn't respond. He tightened his grip on his gun, but before he could react, Robert raised his hands in mock surrender. "No need for violence," Robert said calmly. "I just came to see how things were going. It's been interesting watching you chase your tail for the past few months." Ridley's mind raced. Robert had been watching him the entire time, playing with him, just as he had played with Sarah. "You're under arrest, Kane," Ridley growled, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Robert chuckled softly. "Arrest me? On what grounds?" "You've got nothing, Sheriff. Nothing but the word of a woman who's lost her mind." Ridley raised a notebook. "I've got this. Your little diary." "It's over, Robert." For the first time, Robert's smile faltered. His eyes flicked to the notebook, and Ridley could see the calculation happening behind them. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the flicker of concern vanished, replaced by that cold, confident smile. "You think that's going to stop me?" Robert asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You think a few words on paper can bring me down?" Ridley took a step forward, his gun still trained on Robert. "It's enough to put you away for the rest of your life." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, without warning, Robert lunged. Ridley fired a shot, but Robert was fast, too fast. The bullet grazed his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He tackled Ridley to the ground, the notebook flying from his grasp as they struggled. The two men grappled, their fists colliding in a brutal fight for control. Ridley was strong, but Robert was cunning, using every dirty trick in the book to gain the upper hand. For a moment, it seemed like Robert would win, but with a surge of adrenaline, Ridley managed to overpower him, slamming him to the ground. Breathing heavily, Ridley pressed his gun to Robert's chest. "It's over," he growled. Robert smiled again, even as blood trickled from his mouth. "You may have won the battle, Sheriff," he whispered, "but the war is far from over." Ridley's heart pounded as he handcuffed Robert and radioed for backup. Even in defeat, Robert seemed eerily calm, as though he knew something Ridley didn't. As the deputies arrived and dragged Robert away, Ridley stood in the doorway of the honeymoon suite, the weight of the investigation finally settling on his shoulders. He had captured Robert Kane, but the uneasy feeling in his gut remained. Robert had been right about one thing. The war wasn't over, because somewhere, deep in the recesses of his mind, Ridley knew that Robert Kane wasn't just a killer. He was a predator, and predators didn't stop hunting. Even behind bars, Ridley feared, Robert Kane would always be waiting for his next move. And so, the town of Silver Creek was left to wonder. Would Robert strike again? Or was the worst already over? The answer, Ridley knew, would come in time.